Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Bud Heckman with the Religion Communicators Council. I serve as the Vice President of RCC nationally. We're very pleased today to have with us Diane Moore from the Religious Literacy Project at Harvard University. And she's going to be sharing with us about her experience working with religious literacy as a subject. As many of you know, Religion Communicators Council a little over a year ago committed to making religious literacy a programmatic focus of our Professional Development Association, meaning that we would give attention to it in the resources that we have on our website, that we would give attention to it in the programming that we do in our conference, in our local chapter meetings, and in our webinars that we offer. And Diane just happens to be the foremost expert in the issue. We have had the pleasure of having a couple of other people who are noted in the field. Stephen Prothero and Charles Haynes joined us last year for the beginning of our RCC conference. And this year we had a few different people that looked at it from different angles. So glad that so many of you have joined on. If you would just offer questions in the chat box as we go along, and then I'll try to read some of those out. We'll ask you to mute yourselves if you have not already, or I'll mute you if you have not, just to prevent interruptions in the webinar. But welcome to the Religion Communicators Council webinar here with Diane Moore. And Diane, take it away and tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, and we'll go to a Q&A session after you've gone along a bit, okay?
Great. Thanks so much, Bud, and thanks for the invitation to be with you all. Welcome, everyone. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. My own work here at Harvard has been focused on promoting public understanding of religion through several different venues, and the Religious Literacy Project is our most recent representation of a series of efforts over the last decade, working primarily with educators, but now expanding to include journalists. I'm currently serving on a task force through the State Department to help look at training for foreign service officers around these questions. And Steve Prothero and I actually are partnering to launch a 2-year initiative on religious literacy in the professions that will start next year, that'll focus on journalism, public and global health, business, and government. So again, this is timely issues, and I'm happy to have an opportunity to meet and interact with all of you, and hope that some of what I share will be beneficial. My thoughts today, and if this doesn't end up being useful, literally, I would love for you to interrupt me, but if you can help just monitor the chat. What I suggest that I'll do is that I'll introduce you to the fundamental method that we promote here through the Religious Literacy Project, and that represents my own work. It's really a framework for how to think about religion. Some of it I think will be very will be potentially self-evident to you and that you may already know. But one of the things I've found in my work with professionals across a whole host of fields is that to have this in a succinct form and language has been helpful for them. So I'm going to suggest that we move in that direction. But if this ends up feeling either too rudimentary or already that you're aware of, I'm happy to open it up and we can just discuss maybe some contemporary case studies. If time permits and interest permits, I do have a couple links that I'll share in terms of problematic representations in journalism, which many of you may already be aware of, and then end with some a couple suggestions for what I see to be very exemplary representations of journalists doing work in religion and religious literacy that we in the project are really excited about. So that's the plan, and I hope it'll be useful. So I'll go ahead and do a screen share here. Introduce you to this. So is that, Bud, can you see that?
Yep.
Great. So again, I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because I want to make sure we do have time for conversations. But stop me if you want to discuss something. And again, Bud, thanks for monitoring that one. So I want to just be really explicit about the premises that inform my own work and the frameworks that have led me to this work. First, that there's widespread illiteracy about religion that spans the globe. I used to work primarily in the U.S., but now I've had occasion to work with, again, educators and now foreign service officers in several parts of the globe, realizing that the context matters, of course, in terms of the manifestations of the ways that religion is problematically represented, that in fact there are some very consistent themes that we've noticed through the years that in one way is one of the legacies of colonialism, is actually one of the ways that we understand why those themes are consistent. So I do make this relatively bold claim that this is a problem that does span the globe. Second premise is that there are many consequences to this. The ones that I'm most concerned about are specific consequences, in the sense that they represent, they hinder opportunities for cooperative endeavors, and they also fuel prejudice and bigotry. And so my understanding about this work is that much of the reproduction of problematic assumptions about religion is often done unwittingly. And so part of it is to bring consciousness to a better set of tools for how to think about religion, which is again the focus of the project. And then finally, that we can actually make a difference by promoting a nuanced understanding of religion through education and journalism. Journalism being a really primary source, of course, where people get information about religion. Whether that's fair or not, or whether the expectation of what we then put on journalists in terms of educating us about religion, I think is terribly unfair. But we do know that there are two primary sources of information that people have about religion. One is through journalism and the media, and the second is through one's own faith tradition or none, through one's own family of origin. And both of those are troubling points of understanding, points of departure for understanding religion in the context of helping give people nuanced understanding. So I hope that this again, these thumbnail representations will be helpful. The definition of illiteracy about religion, it's not really for me about the information, content-driven information, the 10 Four Noble Truths, 5 Pillars kind of approach, which is often the way we think about illiteracy about religion. The approach that I've been advocating and that we advocate through the American Academy of Religion and through the Religious understanding the diversity of expression.
That's the picture right now.
A lack of understanding that diversity of expressions and beliefs within traditions and emerging historical context, and the profound role that religions play in human, social, cultural, life and contemporary. So again, there's background noise, but is that you or is there?
There's some people that have joined on. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Great. Okay, good. I just want to ask to mute the microphones there. So definitions of literacy then, conversely, is the ability to discern and analyze the fundamental intersections of religion and social, political, and cultural life through several lenses. So we do want people to have an understanding of the beliefs and practices of religious traditions, but not in isolation, but as they arose out of and continue to be shaped by historical cultural context. So there's a living tradition dimension of religion. And then secondly, the ability to discern and explore the ways that religion is embedded in all dimensions of human experience. So it's not an isolated entity, the way that's often represented, certainly in the US context, but I think in others as well. So examples of illiteracy. Religious traditions are represented as uniform and static, as opposed to diverse and evolving. We hear this all the time. Muslims believe this, Christians believe this. Those are problematic assertions because of the incredible internal diversity of religion. Religions are represented as positive or negative. This is also incredibly problematic and troubling. So we hear assertions that when we see representations of religion that are problematic or troubling through ISIL or ISIS or in the US context, maybe the Westboro Baptist Church representations, we want to say, well, that's political, or, that's political Islam or political Christianity. That's not really Christianity. That's not the true representation of Islam, the true representation of Christianity. From this approach, all of those, the full spectrum of representations of religions are legitimate representations of religion. We can't say that religions are positive or negative. Another example of illiteracy is that religions is nearly, deeply, and exclusively equated with sectarianism. So any event that has religion in its title is basically going to be about promoting, the assumption is going to be about promoting a particular religious worldview, as opposed to a more nuanced and capacious understanding of religion. It's a very common representation of illiteracy. That we hear a lot about, especially in education, because the notion of religion and education together often asserts people believe will be inevitably about proselytizing. Another final, not final, but close, we're almost done with this list. Practitioners and religious leaders are assumed to be experts of their tradition. This is a very troubling and very common assertion about the fact that the leaders and religious practitioners are often looked to be spokespeople for the entirety of the tradition. There's a problem with that because leaders and religious practitioners are trained in a particular representation of the religion appropriately. And that's part of the importance of what it means to be a religious leader and a religious practitioner, is that you have a very specific set of understandings about what it is that you, how you understand the representation of your religion. So when we then equate those people with experts in the entirety of the tradition, there's a real problem because we are expecting them to be able to represent things that their training, by definition, doesn't expose them to. Some religious leaders and practitioners are also trained in religious studies. It's just a different way to understand religion. But the distinction when we conflate them too simply is really troubling and leads to a whole host of challenging consequences.
Diane, I'll just interject quickly to invite those people who are on the call to please pull up the chat box and feel free to fill out some of the chat questions. We'll go to open questions at the end, but it's easier if you submit written questions based on some of the comments you're making. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bud. Good idea. So then finally, religion's assumed to be a private matter. And that, again, is another representation of illiteracy, where we think, well, religion is about internal and private belief and practice, and it doesn't have anything to do with political, economic, or social life. That, again, is another representation of a problematic assertion about religion. So I want to do two very brief examples here. Some of you may know these examples, but they're problematic and I think obvious ways when we see them. But I want to underscore one thing. I'm not representing these to make fun of or to ridicule the journalists involved, because what I really think is these represent is the deeply embedded ways that these assumptions about religion are so profound and so ubiquitous that these very fine journalists otherwise end up reproducing them in spite of Reza Aslan, religious studies scholars' attempt to clarify and to help give them better understanding of their questions. They still couldn't even hear them. So again, this is not to ridicule the journalists, it's to give an example of how deeply embedded these assumptions are. So I hope this is gonna work, and I'm gonna bring us to, I'm not gonna see the whole clips of either one of these. The first one will be a CNN interview with Don Lemon and Alison Camerata, again, interviewing Reza Aslan based on a commentary that Bill Maher made about Islam. And then the second one is by the religion correspondent for Fox News, Lauren Green. Also, it happens to be also interviewing Reza Aslan, who's one of the people that news outlets choose to interview because he's very articulate and a host of reasons why they choose him. But he happens to be the subject of both of these. So again, quick excerpts, and I'll cut it off so we won't spend too much time, but you'll get the flavor of the concerns that these represent, I think, really early on. So I hope this is going to work.
Defenders of Islam insist it is a peaceful religion. Others disagree and point to the primitive treatment in Muslim countries of women and other minorities.
So let's discuss this now. We're joined now by Reza Aslan, a scholar of religions, professor at the University of California, Riverside, and the author of Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Let's talk about this because it's a very interesting conversation every time we have it. Before we get into this discussion, I want to play for you this clip from Bill Maher's show just this Friday night. Here it is.
President Obama keeps insisting that ISIS is not Islamic. Well, maybe they don't practice the Muslim faith the same way he does. But if vast numbers of Muslims across the world believe, and they do, that humans deserve to die for merely holding a different idea or drawing a cartoon or writing a book or eloping with the wrong person, not only does the Muslim world have something in common with ISIS, it has too much in common with ISIS. There's so much talk. You can applaud.
He went on for a good 5 or 6 minutes about that, talking about how women or circumcision for women, not respecting the rights of women, not respecting the rights of gay people. And what's your reaction? And then we'll talk.
Well, I like Bill Maher. I've been on his show a bunch of times. He's a comedian, but, frankly, when it comes to the topic of religion, he's not very sophisticated in the way that he thinks. I mean, the argument about the female genital mutilation being an Islamic problem is a perfect example of that. It's not an Islamic problem. It's an African problem.
Well, wait, because he says it's a, hold on a second, Reza, because he says it's a Muslim country problem. He says that in Somalia.
Yeah, but that's Yeah, and that's actually empirically, factually incorrect. It's a Central African problem. Eritrea has almost 90% female genital mutilation. It's a Christian country. Ethiopia has 75% female genital mutilation. It's a Christian country. Nowhere else in the Muslim majority states is female genital mutilation an issue. But again, this is the problem, is that you make these facile arguments like that women are somehow mistreated in the Muslim world. Well, that's certainly true in many Muslim majority countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. Do you know that Muslims have elected 7 women as their heads of states in those Muslim majority countries? How many women do we have as head of states in the United States?
Reza, be honest, so for the most part, it is not a free and open society for women in those states.
Well, it's not in Iran, it's not in Saudi Arabia, it certainly is in Indonesia and Malaysia, it certainly is in Bangladesh, it certainly is in Turkey. I mean, again, this is the problem, is that you're talking about a religion of 1.5 billion people, and certainly becomes very easy to just simply paint them all with a single brush by saying, well, in Saudi Arabia, they can't drive, and so therefore, that's somehow representative of Islam. It's representative of Saudi Arabia. In Iran, they don't have...
I mean, I think that Bill Maher's point is that these aren't extremists. We often talk about extremists and that we should crack down on extremists. And why aren't Muslims speaking out about extremists? In Saudi Arabia, when women can't vote and they can't drive and they need permission from their husband, that's not extremists. Why aren't we talking more about what? That's not extremist, that's commonplace. Why don't we talk more about the commonplace wrongs that are happening in these countries?
It's extremist when compared to the rights and responsibilities of women, Muslim women around the world. It's an extremist way of dealing with it.
But it's not extremist in that country in Saudi Arabia. That's the norm.
Oh, no, it's not. I mean, look, Saudi Arabia is one of the most, if not the most extremist Muslim country in the world. In the month that we've been talking about ISIS and their terrible actions in Iraq and Syria, Saudi Arabia, our closest ally, has beheaded 19 people. Nobody seems to care about that because Saudi Arabia sort of preserves our national interests. Okay. You know, this is the problem, is that these kinds of conversations that we're having aren't really being had in any kind of legitimate way. We're not talking about women in the Muslim world. We're using 2 or 3 examples to justify a generalization. That's actually the definition of bigotry.
All right, fair enough. Let's listen to Benjamin Netanyahu at the United Nations.
Okay, I'm gonna now bring us to one other clip. This is from Fox News, Lauren Green again, interviewing Reza Aslan now about his book, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Sorry, trying to get to it. Doesn't work unless I put it into the, almost there. Here we go.
Reza Aslan was a Christian but converted back to the faith of his forefathers. It's Islam. He has now written a book about Jesus. The book has become controversial as it calls into question some of the core tenets of Christianity. And the book is called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. And Reza joins me now from Los Angeles. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is an interesting book. Now, I want to clarify, you're a Muslim, so why did you write a book about the founder of Christianity?
Well, to be clear, I am a scholar of religions with 4 degrees, including 1 in the New Testament and fluency in Biblical Greek, who has been studying the origins of Christianity for 2 decades, who also just happens to be a Muslim. So it's not that I'm just some Muslim writing about Jesus. I am an expert with a PhD in the history of religions. But I've been obsessed with Jesus.
Though, it still begs the question, why would you be interested in the founder of Christianity?
Because it's my job as an academic. I am a professor of religion, including the New Testament. That's what I do for a living, actually. So, I mean, it would be like asking a Christian why they would write a book about, Islam. I mean, I'm not sure about that. But honestly, I've been obsessed with Jesus for really 20 years. I've been studying his life and his work and the origins of Christianity both in an academic environment and in a personal level for about 2 decades. And just to be clear, this is not some attack on Christianity. My mother is a Christian. My wife is a Christian. My brother-in-law is an evangelical pastor. Anyone who thinks that this book is an attack on Christianity has not read it yet.
I want to read you some quotes from some people who are criticizing you. One from John Dickerson, who has written an op-ed piece on FoxNews.com, and he says, it's not a historian's report on Jesus. Is it an educated Muslim's opinion about Jesus? He says its conclusions are long-held Islamic claims, namely that Jesus was a zealous prophet type who didn't claim to be God.
Well, that's actually not what Islam claims about Jesus. My book about Jesus overturns pretty much everything that Islam also thinks about Jesus as well. And to be clear, I just want to emphasize this one more time. I am a historian. I am a PhD in the history of religions.
So, again, I hope those representations are clear related to examples of the illiteracies that I just outlined. And again, I want to just underscore that I'm not trying to shame those journalists. I think it's a commentary on the depth of assumption about religion that is so pervasive in our culture, where assumptions that are troubling about religion just seem to be self-evident truths to so many people, not just journalists, but many people in many, many disciplines. So the challenge of representing a better and more nuanced understanding of religion is against a backdrop of deeply embedded assumptions that are troubling and problematic. So I want to just now give you the framework for the ways to understand religion that, again, we promote here through the project, through the American Academy of Religion, and through the work that I've done in my own scholarship. This particular set of representations, these 4 points, are just pretty fundamental to religious studies approaches to religion. So these are pretty widespread. I won't say they aren't without any detractors within the scholarship of religion and scholarship of religious studies, but they are widely held. And then there are subsets of assumptions about religion that are more contested in terms of different approaches, phenomenological, historical. The approach that I promote is a critical theory approach, which I'll talk about momentarily. But these 4 points are relatively, again, straightforward and uniform. And I'm going to suggest that they become potential thumbnail sketches about ways to remember, or ways to think about religion, which is, again, what we try to promote through the project. So again, first is the importance of making a distinction between a devotional assertion of a religious belief and the study or the engagement of the recognition even of diverse devotional expressions. This key factor is really one of the more prominent and important ones, because we so often, again, conflate a devotional assertion with the study of religion. And therefore, then the conversations end up being which devotional assertion is the more true representation of whatever tradition we're looking at, as opposed to recognizing that there are, by definition, which is the second point, that religions are themselves internally diverse. And they're not just internally diverse in terms of different sects within religions, Sunni, Shia, and Islam, Theravada, Mahayana, and Buddhism, Methodist, Mormon, Roman Catholic, etc., and Christianity. But even within communities, even within religious traditions themselves, that there's incredible internal diversity, even within particular congregations or temples. There's always internal diversity of interpretation. So this notion of the diversity of interpretation, coupled with a recognition of the distinction between the devotional assertion of a belief and the recognition or study of diverse devotional assertions, becomes really a key factor in better understanding the complexities of religion. The third point is that religions evolve and change. They're not static entities. So the problematic ways that we often teach about religions in school and sometimes in public conversation is we'll learn about ritual practices, for example, the 5 pillars, the 4 noble truths, the 10 commandments. Those become then reified as though there's a kind of uniformity about those beliefs and a uniformity about those across time and across geographical region. So first of all, not all Christians, etc., Muslims practice those assertions. And then even those that do, the nature of what those assertions how they are interpreted is profoundly different and distinctive, differing social historical contexts. So again, the key here is religions are living traditions. They're animated by the social cultural context of adherence, and they inform and are informed by those contexts. And so this diversity of religion, as well as its evolution and change, is really key factors. And just to give an example of these two together, religions internally diverse and the notion that religions evolve and change. Here in the U.S. context, we know that the Roman or the Southern Baptist Convention has now, in the last 2 decades, been at the forefront of campaigns that challenge the moral legitimacy of abortion. They are not alone, but they are very much at the forefront and very consistent in the last couple decades about their challenges to any form of abortion as being religiously and morally acceptable. And they had very many public policy successes in helping to cut back on the availability of abortions across the United States in many contexts. So this is pretty well known now. What people don't often know is that in the 1970s, right before Roe v. Wade, the landmark Supreme Court decision about abortion, and then for another decade following Roe v. Wade, the Southern Baptist Convention passed several resolutions that affirmed the moral legitimacy of abortion under certain circumstances, including the health and well-being of the mother, abortions, acceptable abortion under the cases of rape and incest, even, and one resolution, the economic well-being of the family related to the bringing into life another child. So they were much more nuanced in their understanding, not across the board saying that all abortions are acceptable, but they even said that we're trying to find a middle ground between abortion as murder and abortion as a form of birth control. Now, whatever you think about abortion, and whatever you think about the Southern Baptist Convention, the key here that we're trying to emphasize, that I would like us to understand and emphasize, is that, again, even within a given denomination, there was incredible change over a relatively short amount of time. And the question isn't which one's right and wrong from the perspective of the scholarship of religion or religious literacy. The important thing to remember then is to ask questions. Well, what was different? What happened in the 1970s? What were the confluence of factors in the Southern Baptist experience and community that gave rise to those resolutions? And what happened over the course of the last 30 years where those resolutions were then overturned and changed? And recognizing the evolution and change factor is a critical understanding in relationship to understanding, again, religious literacy. So challenging this notion, again, that religions are always static and uniform is a really critical, important way to recognize the complexity of the roles that religions play in human experience. The final point here, of these 4 points that are fundamental to religious studies scholars, is that religions, again, are embedded in all dimensions of human experience and not isolated in terms of, again, separate and from ritual practice. And this is a hard one to understand. And I just want to introduce you to it very briefly, and then I want to open this up to, well, I'll give a couple examples of positive representations of journalism, and then I want to open it up to questions. One way to understand this in the embeddedness of religion is through a lens that I'm going to use. There's many different possibilities, but I'm going to introduce you, if you're not familiar with him already, a father of peace studies named Johann Galtung, who's in his late 80s now. He's still alive and still writing, and he has really helped shape a fundamental understanding of complexity of violence and peace. And I'm applying his framework to then understanding the roles that religions play in this. And just very briefly, again, rather than think about violence and peace, violence specifically as being what we call direct violence only, he's divided up an understanding of violence into 3 segments. Looking at violence as direct violence are the forms of that we often associate with violence: war, maiming, sexual assault, emotional manipulation. But then he looks at 2 other forms of violence: structural violence and cultural violence. Structural violence, and Galtung, you should know, comes out of a Marxist school of thought. So he's echoing Marx's understanding of structural violence here, where he looks at the structures of society that hinder the capacity, certain individuals or types of individuals to have access to the goods and services that will allow for human well-being and human flourishing. So racism, sexism, institutional forms of bigotry of any kind become representations of structural forms of violence. And they can be legal, such as apartheid in South Africa and Jim Crow laws here in the United States, or they can just be cultural, which would be things, examples of limited access to quality education, limited access to quality health care, bullying, etc. We've got someone's got their mic on that's making some background noise. So thanks for turning that off. Finally, for Galtung, his primary contribution, I think, is in this articulation of cultural violence, where he says that cultural violence are the embedded assumptions in a given historical or communal context that give legitimacy, moral or social legitimacy, to direct and structural forms of violence. And that for Galtung, the key to mitigating violence of all kinds is to name those embedded assumptions within cultures that give legitimacy to, again, direct and structural forms of violence. And a quick example about this that is easy to see historically, but his hope is that when we learn about this and can look in historical hindsight, which is easier, that we will also focus that critical lens on our own particular context. But for an example for Galtung that he uses very explicitly is chattel slavery in the United States. There were two primary sources, there are many sources, but two primary sources of cultural violence that gave legitimacy to chattel slavery. One of them was the medical profession, biology, with the study of phrenology, the study of skull sizes. That was a biological science at the time, a very legitimate one, where researchers were making claims about the intelligence of given types of human beings based on their skull shape and size, about their capacity for intelligence and for civilization. And not surprisingly at the time, that those with skull shapes that were originating out of what we now associate with Caucasian or Western European skull shapes and sizes were considered the height of capability for intelligence and civilization and artistic creativity. And those coming out of indigenous cultures, particularly those in Africa and African cultures, were considered primitive and the lowest level of capacity. So that medical set of assumptions that were given medical and biological credibility were one representation that gave, cultural support for the ownership of human beings in the guise of chattel slavery. And another second really powerful force was religion. We know very much, and I'm sure this is not news to any of you, but that Protestant Christianity, particularly in the United States, had a very strong strand of supporting, through biblical interpretation, the legitimacy, moral legitimacy of chattel slavery. And there were many different tracks and many different proponents of slavery that were apologists for supporting, again, this institution in the US context. Now, again, it won't be surprising to also know that it was many, not exclusively, but out of Protestant Christianity, that were leaders in the abolition movement, that also took seriously a very different interpretation of scripture and of tradition to challenge that legitimacy out of the lens of Protestant Christianity, which was itself then a form for Galtung of cultural peace. So direct and cultural peace, direct and violence and peace, structural violence and peace, he recognizes that both are forces. But the reason I'm introducing you to this set of ideas is to say that religion is always a factor in promoting a host of ideologies in any given cultural moment that will promote both cultural violence as well as cultural peace, or represent cultural violence and cultural peace. And again, that just becomes one example. So the key here is to think, what are the functions, what are the roles that religions are playing, complex roles, always in any given cultural moment, recognizing internal diversity of a religious tradition, recognizing that religions evolve and change, and to be able to know as journalists, to be able to think, okay, what is the primary story here? What's happening? What information do we have about any role that religion might play in whatever story we're covering? and to recognize that whatever the primary story is, or the most authoritative voice, or perhaps the voice that's represented most prominently in a given cultural moment, there will always be counter narratives present, always. And the question is, how do we at least recognize that and not reproduce the notion that there's a singular religious representation here, but to also realize that there are counter voices and to help try to tease those out, to understand those, to recognize that the role that religion play is always prominent, whether it's about religion or not. It's always a presence, and then also to really help understand what it means to highlight that complexity in the context of what we're doing through media and through journalism. I want to give one example here, and I'm not going to take us to this link, but I'll share this PowerPoint for those of you who might like to see it, and you may know of her already. Christa Bryant is just one example. There are many who was currently, she's currently now serving as a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard, but she just left her position as the Jerusalem Bureau Chief for the Christian Science Monitor. And she wrote a series of profiles, essentially, on both Israelis and Palestinians, 12 different profiles. Actually, it's just part of a larger series, but this particular article is highlighting 12, where she's really looking and challenging the associations we have with either of these two representations of this conflict. And when we think of Israelis, we think of a particular set of assumptions, and when we think of Palestinians, we think of another. And through these profiles, she's really helping to give nuance to these individuals that is, again, a representation of complexity, inclusive of religion, but not exclusive of other factors, recognizing that religion becomes a particular representation or one representation of these questions. So again, this becomes just one example, and she speaks very clearly, or she spoke very clearly here in her work at the Nieman, as a Nieman Fellow, in some lectures and some classes, the challenge of what it means to be able to speak in more complex forms about these cultural dimensions of religion and the way they play out in a given story, partly because of the challenges that journalism face, the issues of deadline, the issues of readership expectation. And this goes back to, and then this is my final comment, I'll open it up for questions. The role that I think that teachers and journalists are put in an untenable position, really. Teachers are in an untenable position about educating about religious literacy because they rarely themselves have been exposed to the study of religion, religious studies in their own training. Some have, but it's not a normal part of training to be an educator. And yet they're responsible for teaching content in religion and throughout all the state standards in history and English language arts, especially religion's embedded in both of those in both of those disciplines throughout all 50 states. So they have to both teach content and they have to respond to the complexity of their own communities, which will always have a religious diversity within them, and increasingly so with different migrant patterns. So they have to deal with the cultural competence of what it means to be sensitive to the religious communities within their classrooms and their larger community. And they also have to teach about subjects that they don't themselves have very much training in, or if any training. So they're set up, and journalists are set up because it's not the journalist's job to be our primary source of information about religion. That you couldn't possibly don that role, and nor should you. But we expect you to on some level. So there's a lot of ragging. You probably know it well about the problematic ways that journalists represent religion, which is why I want to qualify what my two examples represented from my perspective. It's not so much how awful journalists are, or those particular journalists, but more just the ways that the assumptions are so deeply embedded, and that we really have to both curtail our expectations of what journalists can offer, but also, to the extent that journalists are interested, give them more freedom and potentially more exposure to these ways to think about religion that can enhance the work that you all are doing. So I'm gonna stop there and hope that we still have about 20 minutes for questions, and I hope that this is a helpful way to proceed, and wish I can't see you, so I don't know I don't know how you've been receiving this, but let's open it up. Go ahead, Bud, maybe with that.
Very appreciative. Yeah, can I ask you to de-share your? We'll put you back up as the principal person to de-share your screen share there. There you go. That's great. Thank you. Well, RCC is comprised of people who work in communications, public relations, marketing, and so forth for faith communities. There's two major organizations that are professional organizations in the U.S. Religion Communicators Council works with faith-based people that work in faith-based communities and for organizations that are faith or interfaith in terms of their orientation. And obviously the Religion Newswriters Association that you're very familiar with works with secular-based sources. And one of the key things here is what is the case with regard to what it is that people should visualize in terms of doing in their jobs. A lot of them have jobs that require them basically to focus specifically on the communicating about their particular religious community, Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Reformed Jews, whatever the particular tradition or organization is, and how should they think about the enterprise of religious literacy or their responsibilities for it in the midst of doing their job, given that they may not be a journalist or may not be an educator in a college, some of the two principal pipelines you mentioned.
Right. No, that's great. Thanks for the question. So I just did a presentation yesterday, actually, with a group of interfaith leaders that organize every year. And my response to that question is similar to questions they were also raising. Your role as a journalist coming out of a particular faith-based organization, certainly you'll have particular qualifications. I would hope for and long for journalists in those contexts, however, and religious leaders in their context, to also help their communities think together about this broader landscape of religious literacy, because all of us are functioning within a context of pluralism. And what does it mean to just, not to say that the religious studies approach is the only way, but to be clear about who the audience is and when you are representing a particular devotional or theological view appropriate to your role as a religious leader or a journalist out of a tradition. And when nuancing that or recognizing something other than that, or how that will be received, or anticipating questions about the context in which this information comes out, I think better understanding of the complexities of religion, even within a religious community, is really key to again, advancing a nuanced and sophisticated understanding of religion in the daily parts of what we do as professionals. So I'm hoping that that what I had to say was useful. I hope it's useful, not because the people will fall in one or the other category and those never meet, but that in both categories we have to be sensitive to, again, devotional assertions. People need to be sensitive to the diversity of devotional assertions. In my work, I'm encouraging even people who find devotional assertions that are abhorrent to not just dismiss them as somehow other and negative, but to really start to ask other questions. What are the conditions that are creating the situation that gives rise to ISIL and an ISIS and the kind of, again, the question I raised in relationship to the Southern Baptists. So I hope that answers your question, but basically I'm trying to say that I think this better, more capacious understanding of religious literacy, I hope will be useful for everyone, because I think that's still the context out of which we function.
Mm-hmm. So I invite people who are on to unmute themselves and ask a question individually rather than me unmuting all of you and starting chaos. You should have the power to do that. And if not, pose a question in the chat down below within the webinar. What are the things that you perceive that people need to do to advance education and journalism? What's not happening in those areas that needs to happen within the field of education and journalism in order to be able to advance religious literacy? And here I'd like to ask you to speak about the example of the MOOC that you're doing presently as a vehicle by which people can access resources to know how to do religious literacy better.
Sure. Yeah, thanks again. Also, a great question. So the MOOC I'm doing currently that Bud is referencing, we just finished. It's a series of 6 months MOOC I'm doing with 5 of my colleagues. The title is called World Religions Through Their Scriptures. But the real point of the MOOC is to actually, again, help give people language through this particular entry of Scripture to better have a more nuanced and complex understanding of religion, and even a more nuanced and complex understanding of the roles of what we can actually learn about a religious tradition through Scripture. We can learn some things and we can't learn a lot of other things. The MOOC that I'm responsible for is now fully available in all 8 sessions for anyone, free of charge, is called religious literacy, and it is fundamentally a basic introduction to exactly this set of frameworks that I just gave you, with more complexity and more opportunities for actually really playing this out and trying it out with different exercises, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
What I think journalists, well, this has been interesting because I've been in conversation in anticipation of this project that I just mentioned earlier about that we're working on with Steve Prothero. I've been in conversation with journalists in all media types of representations about exactly what is happening. First of all, a state of the field, if you will. What are the different ways that is already functioning in relationship to how journalists and media experts are thinking about religion? And that's, as you know better than I, incredibly diverse and not at all systematized. So that's one question. Like, how do we think at least more explicitly about what might be the best ways to think about religion, and then the nature of working with members of each of the professions for that initiative I spoke to say, well, how can we be helpful? So rather than just me coming in and saying journalists should do this, we're learning and using this as a foundation to learn what journalists need, what's already functioning that we're learning from, as well as then what we could together create as at least a template or a model. One of the things we have learned, which is what made me have the confidence to share what I just shared with you here, is that the frameworks I did speak about now, journalists have found, in my experience, to be very helpful. Again, some of the things they already knew, but others that they felt like were good to just have as, again, in this kind of more succinct form, just as a way to think about what ends up happening when we do journalism, to be able to ask ourselves, are we reproducing any of those problematic assumptions unwittingly? And how might we be able to just advance slightly more complex understandings?
We have a question that's come into the chat forum that says, it's from Aaron Henry, invite you to comment on the use of language by the writer on religion. In Jordan, I attended a forum between Christians. One of the points made was on the use of language, such as staying away from the use of certain terms such as conversion, which was a particular meaning in that context, or the word substitution, calling themselves followers of Jesus, quote unquote, rather than Christians, quote unquote, because Muslims can embrace that more easily, as they sometimes describe themselves as followers of Muhammad, quote unquote.
Right. So use of language. Okay. I first of all, that's a really important question. And as you're recognizing here, we're in Jordan and you recognize this. Context matters tremendously. And so the question about how we, again, exactly what you're commenting on here, how we represent, even what we call followers of a particular tradition, can have incredible be heard in many different ways and some problematic ways. So I think that becomes a really critical question that a journalist in a given context, or a foreign affairs officer, for example, in a different context. I think this is across the board in all professions. It is you all who are going to be located in particular contexts will know those nuances. What we're trying to promote through this is not to be able to say, all right, if you're in Jordan, don't say this, because that'll also change, it'll evolve, but to just help you recognize that exactly what you say, attention to those questions is really going to be critical. So then keep your ear to the ground. How are people representing themselves? And also to ask questions, not just to wait to hear from the religious leaders of those communities, but to also say, who are the marginalized voices within those communities, particularly women, sexual minorities. They always will exist. They are always there. So you also want to be attentive to say, what are we hearing about appropriate language and appropriate representation of a religion that may be the prominent voice in a given moment historically or culturally, but is not necessarily the representational voice. And then you have to make the very challenging and complex decisions about what you're going to say, because you need to keep your sources open, you need to not offend, but you also want to be careful not to unwittingly reproduce specifically, especially gendered assumptions and sexualized assumptions that are going to make groups of those communities invisible, or make them more invisible, or challenge their their credibility, again, often unwittingly. So all to say, I'm not being very helpful, all to say, you're really right to ask the question. It's a really important one. And you, again, all of you on the ground are the experts in those kinds of questions. We can just say, watch out for it.
So one of the questions we had from our members is, what's something that I can grab and learn about this issue? Do I get Stephen Prothero's book on religious literacy? Do I start reading like Islam 101? What's something that I do to sort of help myself be a better person in terms of how it is that I communicate? Some of our members are starting to discover things like, I would say the word sick instead of the word seek, and that might be more inviting to people of that faith tradition. It's how, there's certain things that I can pick up. What's some good go-to resources? What's in your top 5 list for that?
Well, so I'm going to, again, I don't, this won't sound self-serving, but the Religious Literacy Project has, we've got a very short representation of this method. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. We also have short introductions of all the religious traditions that represent this nuanced understanding, and we're developing further resources. We have country profiles that give some complexity to these, including Syria. Again, we're just building on these, but we've got France, Syria, Nigeria, Qatar, we're developing one, and we've got one on Brazil that we just published, so that you can start to see, again, what does it mean to think in these complex ways about religion. And I think Steve's book is great. One of the things that we're working on here is that he's really looking at his book and saying this notion of like, to know the kind of Four Noble Truths, 5 pillars understanding. And I think that's also important. And I'd say the combination of looking at those factual dimensions of a religious tradition, but also with this recognition of, again, diversity, evolution and change, complexity is a really good combination. But the intention of the Religious Literacy Project is to give resources to professionals. And so I would welcome your visitation to the Religious Literacy Project. You see, we'll have weekly representations of news items that we consolidate to look at representing these complexity, but your feedback on its usefulness would also be terrific. And then finally, when we launch this project on religious literacy in the professions, it'll be a series of symposia, and we're going to want the feedback of and participation of practicing journalists. But I might actually be in conversation with you about some suggestions you might have for people to not only be representing the panels that we're putting together, but also to spread the word for journalists to join us for that symposia.
That's great. Thank you. I want to give some further opportunity. There may be people who are not able to respond via the chat, so I am going to go to the crazy step of unmuting everybody to see whether we can have some questions for those people on audio.
Great.
So go ahead. Does anyone have a question who's joining us by phone or hasn't figured out how the chat feature works that you'd like to pose to Diane? Please identify yourself and the organization that you're with, and we have a few minutes left. Karen, you have a question? Hi. Can you hear us? Yeah. Right.
Well, I was thinking about a question, so you could read my mind. I was looking. I found it very helpful what was said. This direct violence, structural violence, cultural violence, and peace. And I was just wondering, where does hate speech come in there? Because this is a word we hear all the time now. Hate speech is used in many contexts at the moment, and so I was just reflecting about that. I didn't dare to ask the question, but I was just reflecting about that.
I'm so glad you dared to ask it, because I think it's obviously a really ubiquitous challenge across the globe now. I think hate speech becomes a representation of cultural violence, of course, but the key is that what are the conditions that allow for hate speech to be acceptable? And that's usually a structural form of violence that it's representing, that is, again, deeply embedded and then now gaining cultural legitimacy because, again, it gives prominence to the structural forms of violence and direct forms of violence that we see playing out so prominently across the globe. So in a sense, it's not a canary because it's so explicit, but the rise in hate speech and public discourse should be a terribly urgent alarm for all of us, because the structural forms of violence are functioning pretty consistently. There are very few places where we've eradicated structural forms of violence, and those tend to be more in smaller communities. They're not nation states for sure. But when we are in a time where explicit forms of hate speech are acceptable, we know that we are in dire straits, because usually in other cultural contexts, we know that those sentiments might be present, but they're not socially acceptable to express. So I would just say that let's watch for, and what are the institutions, what are the organizations, what are the leaders, who are the prominent people who are supporting that form of speech, and the key factor for me is to help give attention to and credibility and voice to those who are challenging it, to give them, to recognize this isn't just because it's prominent doesn't mean it's uniform and universal. And we do need to help give voice to those who are challenging the representations that many of us are finding so troubling right now. And to then ask this further question of what is, again, giving rise to the credibility of that hate speech, because that's really the heart of the question that we need to all of us together wrestle with in a pluralist communities.
Diane, I wanted to mention that we have had a relationship with Bruce McEver and the Foundation for Religious Literacy. They have helped sponsor programming for us, both at last year's conference and our recent conference in New York. And hopefully that relationship will continue. I know he's been a supporter of the Religious Literacy Project, a generous supporter.
That's a great connection. In fact, that helps me now just say explicitly that Bruce McEver is our funder for the Religious Literacy in the Professions Initiative. And we're really grateful for that. I haven't publicized that yet because we literally just getting underway. But he's been a terrific supporter. And I'm so glad to hear of this, reminded of this connection.
He cares about it wonderfully. I also want to mention that we have a number of the resources and connections to that you mentioned earlier that are at your project at Harvard. And we also have advertised and given connection to the MOOC, the massive online course that you have. But I wanted to ask you to reiterate just at the end of the call here, whether it's possible for people to be able to still join in. I know it's already started, but it goes through the end of the summer. Can we jump in and...
Oh, yes, thank you. And the whole MOOC world is relatively new to many of us, and maybe many of you are already much more familiar with it. But yes, so the 6-month course, series of courses really, 6 months of modules, 6 modules, are available in live form. And what that means is that your participation, you'll be involved in engaging with the course with other people at the same time, all the way through the end of August. And the schedule rollout is that religious literacy rolled out in March. Currently, Christianity is rolling out. Next will be Buddhism in April, Buddhism in May, and then I think Islam in June, and then Hinduism in July, and Judaism in August. But the point being is that once the courses are out, are publicized, and are live, you can just go through it at any time, and you will have discussion partners, because people are still taking and starting my MOOC on religious literacy, even though now we're in the middle of Christianity. So you absolutely can come in, and because we've got there are 35,000 people who have signed up for religious literacy. That's alone. And then Karen's got another, I think, 10 or 12, 15,000. So with that kind of number, you'll always have partners, and we are still monitoring all the discussion boards on that, so that you'll be engaging with the teaching staff all through the summer as long as the course is live. So I hope people will take advantage of it. If you can just dip in, I think you'll be inspired by the quality of conversations that are being generated by 30,000 people representing 175 different countries. It's very inspiring to me.
I think I want to buy you a T-shirt that says, "Yeah, but I'm huge on the internet." That's a lot of people to join in on a course for reaching a lot more than you can in a traditional classroom. It's really wonderful to have you with us today. You're very tight in what it is you presented, and very helpful, practical information for us as well. This will be made available to our members shortly on our website, and we'll work to refreshen some of the materials and so forth that we referred to in our religious literacy section. And hopefully continue to engage with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.